Whether you believe that witchcraft is real or not, the history of witches in the UK is very controversial. It has become common knowledge that many people accused of witchcraft, most of them women, were in fact innocent, though this still didn't save many from suffering harsh punishments and even death. Overall, the UK has witnessed a gradual shift towards a more secular society over the past century, and beliefs related to witchcraft have changed drastically. There are many fascinating and often questionable stories about witches in the Middle Ages, but not so many people know the story of one of the last women to be convicted under the Witchcraft Act in the middle of the 20th century. This is the story of Helen Duncan. Helen Duncan was born Victoria Helen McCrae McFarlane in Callander, Perthshire, Scotland, on November the 25th, 1897. She came from a working-class family and was one of 8 children of builder and slater Archibald McFarlane and his wife Isabella. As a small child, Helen earned the nickname Hellish Nell for her tomboyish way of behaving, her occasional hysterical outbursts and sinister predictions. Indeed, her youth is filled with stories of strange events, from her hearing disembodied voices, receiving warnings about friends and loved ones, and seemingly passing out while sitting a test in school, only to come round to find her work finished and all questions answered correctly. All this much to the chagrin of her devoutly Presbyterian mother. As a teenager, Helen started working in Dundee, first in a jute mill and later as a nurse. She had decided to turn her hand to nursing after suffering a bout of tuberculosis. After receiving care in a sanatorium, she felt that her future lay with caring for others. She would eventually meet with First World War veteran Henry Duncan after he was sent home from the army after suffering rheumatic fever. There are claims that each had seen a vision of the other before they had met, with Helen stating she was told he would be the man she marries. On May 27, 1919, that is exactly what happened. Henry then began working for a cabinet maker and, while not without their struggles, life seemed to be going well. But as is often the case, tragedy was lurking around the corner. At just 13 months old, the couple's third child, Henrietta, sadly died of pneumonia. This sent both parents into a deep depression, eventually resulting in Henry suffering a heart attack. Thankfully, he survived, but was left too weak to work. This heaped pressure on Helen, who had to juggle working in a bleach factory while caring for her husband and growing family. As the years passed, she had not neglected her supposed powers and was now hosting weekly meetings and séances with friends and others who claimed to have paranormal capabilities. Each sitting would start with the group saying a prayer or reading from the Bible after a previous attempt to summon spirits apparently led to a fireplace being destroyed when a not-so-friendly spirit came through. Often during these séances, it's claimed that the spirit of a Dr. Williams would instruct Helen and her husband on ways to improve her connection with the spirit world. These included fastening a curtain across one corner of the room and using a red light and trumpet to increase the volume of the spirit's voice and help in producing physical manifestations. Eventually, Dr. Williams was replaced by another spirit, Donald, who instructed those present to begin inviting others to the meetings. As word of Helen's séances grew, she quickly came to the attention of the London Psychic Centre, home of the Psychic Union. After undergoing a series of tests, she was awarded a diploma, and as a newly certified medium, she visited many of the Union's churches up and down the country. It was during this period that Helen had her first brush with the law when she was charged with fraud after a woman apparently caught her trying to hide a ball of material under her clothes. She believed this would then be used to produce a supposed manifestation. Her trial began in Edinburgh on May the 3rd, 1933, and lasted several days. While some sources state that it eventually ended in a verdict of not proven, with Helen simply being fined £10 for swearing, newspapers from the time state that she was in fact found guilty of fraud, with the fine being in place of spending a week in prison. Whatever the verdict may have been, the news coverage only served to grow the demand for Helen's services. The Second World War brought many visits from anxious relatives, especially those who had lost close family during the conflict. One phenomenon or trick, depending on your point of view, that Helen was famous for was producing ectoplasm. This very curious and shocking practice took place during her medium sessions. Duncan would enter a trance-like state, and it was claimed a paranormal substance known as ectoplasm would emanate from her body, often from her mouth or nose. These expulsions would often form figures, sometimes even with faces. Though she was a major proponent of the practice, Duncan wasn't the only medium that displayed this bizarre talent. Quote, "In the early 20th century, spiritualist photography took a curious turn. Suddenly, mediums were photographed grappling with strange fibrous materials that emerged from their mouths, noses, and ears, or twisted out from corners like writhing tentacles." Unquote. The practice was eventually proven to be faked, with people managing to take snippets of the material to be tested in laboratory analysis. There, it was revealed as being created using a mixture of cheesecloth, egg whites, and various chemicals to fake the appearance of a supposed ethereal being. These tricks and practices may all seem very silly looking back at the photographs from that time. But remember that this was happening nearly 100 years ago, and her clients were often grief-stricken people who were so affected by the death of a loved one that they simply did not care. Sometimes, needing to cope with the loss will make you do things you wouldn't normally do and believe people who may not be trustworthy. While the ectoplasm phenomenon may be easily dismissed, one of Helen's psychic predictions proved more difficult to discredit. In fact, the details of her presage were so specific and involved something so secret that it would bring her practices to the attention of the British Navy. In November 1941, Helen Duncan held a séance in Portsmouth, England, where she reportedly made several accurate statements regarding a naval disaster. The sinking of the HMS Barham, a British battleship, was top secret at the time due to wartime censorship. However, Duncan apparently described the sinking in detail, including the fact that the ship had been hit by 3 torpedoes before it exploded. These details were apparently passed to her from a sailor who had died in the attack, whose mother was present during the séance. In the book, The Two Worlds of Helen Duncan, written in part by one of Helen's daughters, it stated that the mother of the sailor confronted naval authorities, who then began looking into Helen's practices. It's believed that they were concerned that Duncan might have obtained classified information through espionage rather than through supernatural means. During another séance in 1944, 2 naval officers were in attendance when Helen stated that a figure claimed to be one of the officers, Lieutenant Worth's dead aunt. Another claimed to be his deceased sister, but he had no dead aunt or sister and was disgusted by what he had seen and heard. Worth then reported the events to the police. On January 19, 1944, Helen Duncan was arrested and initially charged under the Vagrancy Act, but this would later be changed to a charge of fraudulent spiritual activity under the Witchcraft Act of 1735. Between the 16th and 18th centuries in Scotland, the public and rulers of those times, such as King James VI, became increasingly concerned about magical practices and people dealing with malevolent forces. The Witchcraft Act of 1563 made witchcraft practices, or even consulting with so-called witches, punishable as capital offences. This had a strong impact on society for the next couple of centuries. Many people took advantage of this law for their own gain. It was estimated that nearly 4,000 people were tried for witchcraft during this time, with some 2,500 of them being executed between 1563 and 1727. The majority of those who were killed, over 80%, were women and most likely innocent. In 1735, a new Witchcraft Act was passed which made it a crime to claim a person had magical powers or were guilty of practicing witchcraft. This was a near complete reversal of the 1563 Act and reflected a wider move away from witch trials and executions. The last execution for witchcraft having taken place just a few years earlier in 1727. So, in actuality, Helen Duncan wasn't charged with being a witch, but with claiming to have magical powers, fraudulent witchcraft. This detail did nothing to quell the public and media outrage that would ensue. The UK, like much of the rest of the world, had witnessed many shocking and tragic occurrences during the war, and now the mention of witchcraft was thrown into the mixer. Despite the public outcry and Duncan offering to demonstrate her supposed abilities to the court, on April 3, 1944, she was found guilty of contravening the Witchcraft Act of 1735 and sentenced to 9 months in prison. After the verdict was read, she cried out, "I didn't do anything. Oh God, is there a God?" While it's believed that her trial and imprisonment were somehow orchestrated by the government and/or military who feared she could reveal more secrets, days after the trial, Winston Churchill wrote a letter to the Home Secretary stating he believed that the whole debacle had been a waste of resources. He went on to describe the charges as obsolete tomfoolery. Despite this, Helen Duncan would not be the last to stand trial under the Witchcraft Act. Later that same year, in September of 1944, a 72-year-old woman named Jane York from Forest Gate, East London, was charged under the same act. She faced 7 counts of pretending to conjure up spirits of the dead. Her punishment was simply to pay £5 and be of good behaviour for 3 years. As for Helen, though an appeal saw nearly 40 witnesses testify that what they saw at the séances had convinced them of life after death, it was ultimately rejected, and she would serve out her entire sentence, being released in 1945. Though she promised never to hold a séance again, she was arrested for doing so in 1956. There would be no threat of a second trial under the Witchcraft Act, as it's theorised, in no small part due to the negative reaction to her initial trial. The Act had since been repealed and replaced with the Fraudulent Mediums Act of 1951. The repeal of this Witchcraft Act was part of broader legal reforms and reflected changing attitudes towards superstition and belief in the supernatural. This did not, of course, mean there was a definitive end to beliefs in witchcraft or occult practices, but it did mark a significant shift in how these beliefs were viewed in the law. It was a recognition of the increasing secularization of society and a move towards more rationalistic approaches to law and justice. As she awaited charges under this new law, Helen Duncan passed away on December 6, 1956. Her supporters claim this was due to ectoplasm violently receding into her body after the police, knocking at the door, disturbed her while she was in a trance. Helen's legacy is a complex one that still causes discussion and controversy to this day. The spiritualist is still used as an example of a famous fraudulent medium. However, there are also still some people who believe that her powers were real. Whichever side of the debate you land on, it does seem like her services did relieve some anxiety and bring a form of closure to a number of people who lost members of their family in the war. In an age where treating mental health was uncommon, she managed to bring them a kind of peace. However, many would still say that she actually took advantage of those who were in mourning and gave false hope to people who wanted proof that there was something tangible out there after death. A bust created in her honour was presented to her hometown of Callander in Scotland. But backlash from those with strong religious views who objected to its public display led to it being moved to a museum in nearby Stirling. Despite her detractors, there has been an ongoing campaign to pardon Helen. In 2008, the Scottish Parliament rejected a petition for this to happen. There were controversies around the reasons for which she was convicted, with people saying that the reasons were mostly political. A website set up by the Helen Duncan Foundation, part of the International Society for Scientific Mediumship and Parapsychological Investigation, states they don't want a pardon. Instead, they want those who they believe wrongly convicted her to apologize and admit she was a remarkable medium who served the people. But what do you believe? Do you think that it's possible for people to converse with the dead? I mean, how could she have known about the sinking of the HMS Barham? Several answers to the latter question have been posited over the years. One theory states that while the sinking wasn't public knowledge, many family members received letters of condolence asking them to keep the sinking secret until the official announcement. Others point to a professor who had been told about the sinking and believed it had already been revealed to the public. Wherever you stand on the controversial issue of mediumship, the case of Helen Duncan is a notable chapter in Britain's legal history, and again shines a light on how primarily women have faced persecution over the years for being witches and for not being witches. Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.